Thank you so much for that uh, beautiful welcome, Kelly. And I thank you also, Beth and Vanda, and everyone that is a part of this conference today. I'm going to try to share my screen with you. Okay. Is this visible to everyone? Awesome. Awesome. So yes, my name is Wendell Scanterbury, and I count it indeed an honor and a pleasure to be part of the conference today, the Rejuvenate conference, particularly with respect to ovarian cancer. One, I guess, unpublished fact is that my mom actually was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, so I was actually having to function in the role of a caregiver of someone who had been living with an ovarian cancer diagnosis. So today, as we look at the idea of coping with the emotions of a cancer diagnosis, I'm sure for all of those who are cancer survivors here, and that's 80% of the attendees today. So certainly hats off to you, and just bless you in your respective journeys, not only ovarian cancer, but all cancers. And for those who are supporting those living with cancer. Today, as we think about the emotional impact of cancer and what that does, let's see, my slides are not functioning as I programmed them to. That's interesting. Okay. Let me try to repeat this. Okay, I apologize for that. I programmed my slides to flow. And let's see if we can get this working now. All right. So yeah, the idea of cancer, as we might all be familiar with, is the idea of cells that are gone rogue. They're just not following the instructions or the guidance of the body's DNA. And that's what is kind of the power behind metastases and so on. So whether it's a solid tumor cancer, as in ovarian, or any other cancers, is the idea that these cells are just not following the body's direction, right? But particularly with respect to ovarian cancer, as many of you know, many of you who are survivors or who are familiar with ovarian cancer, is that it's often undetected. It's one of those silent cancers. So many times when it is detected, it's at a late stage. And quite often part of the reason for that also is that the symptoms that might kind of raise the red flag or the warning flag about the presence of this abnormality in the body are not symptoms that you would typically associate with that kind of illness. So you might be, I know that was the case with my mom. Often we're looking in another direction to find the cause of these symptoms, and so we might miss the actual reality of it. And so these are some of the things that are already present when you finally do get the diagnosis of cancer, whether it's ovarian or anything else. Some of the underlying realities that we might be unaware of. And so as we think about coping with our emotions, because emotions are profoundly triggered when a cancer diagnosis comes our way, and I know I'm speaking to the choir in this sense, but what we often are not necessarily paying a whole lot of attention to, just because of the sheer intensity of it all, are kind of the time and conditions of the diagnosis. And what I mean by that are a number of things that can intersect when a diagnosis takes place. So for example, when we think of the family system, so what is going on in our relationships? So if we are part of a spousal or partner relationship, what's going on there? Because that's going to factor into how we experience the diagnosis, but also the process that follows that, the decision-making process, the treatment process, and all of that, as well as what's going on in the entire family. So we might all function in different roles, and those things immediately become not that they're not a concern before, they're always a concern, but with the addition of cancer and what it might imply, these things become more urgent concerns. But then we also have to think about our emotional history. And what I mean by emotional history is how have we developed in terms of our emotional experiences. So for example, if someone is a survivor of some kind of trauma, whether it's emotional, psychological, physical, sexual, abuse or so on, for example, in the past, or if my relational experiences in my family of origin or my current family include any kind of abuse or any kind of strain, those are things that are already stressful realities in my life, and those would then be exacerbated when a cancer diagnosis comes. So coping has to take into consideration all these things. Another part of it, which also then factors into how we respond, and that's for the most part unconsciously, has to do with the family illness history. Meaning, how has my family typically dealt with cancer? Or if cancer has been a reality in my family, that is, or any other serious illness. So for example, in my childhood or in any other part of my developmental journey, has the family typically talked about these things? Have people been open to discussion, to acknowledgement, to acceptance of a diagnosis so that it can be addressed in a way that is not avoidant? Because it's not hard, not difficult, quite frankly, it's very common for folks to avoid, to kind of turn inside, shut down my emotions. How are you doing? Everything is fine. But inside, it's a totally different story. You know, we're living in the days of masks. And I think that is a really good metaphor for how many of us tend to deal with our emotions, because we mask them, right? So family illness history has a lot to do with that. How have I learned to deal with the emotional impact of any challenge in life, particularly challenges of illness? And then the larger systems of life. So my family system is one, but what about my professional roles? So work or other social connections or civic engagement that I might be a part of in terms of a larger system. All these things come into play as I think about how I would then cope, or how I should cope emotionally, and what kind of emotions I do feel. So whether I feel defeated or overwhelmed and all these different things. Underlying all of that is our basic needs, emotional needs that we all have, and they all come in the context of relationships. Relationships with ourselves, relationships with others, and relationships with the wider context of our worlds. And we'll get into those more specifically. So 3 basic needs: safety, a sense of safety. We all need to feel safe with ourselves, to feel safe in the context of our families, to feel like, all right, this is a place that I don't have to fear things that might go wrong, or that there are people concerned enough about me to protect me from any kind of danger, not only physical danger, but psychological danger, emotional danger, people that would be present, that I can reach out to, or that I can depend on. I also want to feel a sense of worth. Am I valuable? Many people suffer from low self-esteem, and that could be due to many different experiences that would have contributed to that, but that affects my sense of worth. So how do I see myself? How do I value myself? And how do others value me? So again, in my closest relationships, do I feel like I'm valued? Do I feel like I matter to these people? Do the things that bother me, do the things that make me happy, or do the things that challenge me also, can others relate to that to any degree? Because if I don't feel like people can relate to what I'm experiencing, if I don't feel like I'm valuable enough for people to be concerned or to try to really understand me on a very deep level, then that affects my sense of worth, and it also affects my ability to cope. It affects my capacity to regulate my emotions. And then a sense of belonging. Am I wanted here? Am I desired here? Is this where I can feel at home? This meaning this relationship, this household, even this workplace. Is this a place that I am a part of? And I feel that way, because that would factor into support, and just the sense of being supported really goes a long way into our emotional experiences. So whether I can feel like I'm capable of being or becoming resilient, that's part of, again, being able to cope. So all of that really factors into the reality of us as human beings. We are meaning-making organisms and beings and existences. And so we try to make sense of the things that happen to us, not least of which is a cancer diagnosis. But even in the context of the cancer diagnosis, we try to make sense of the smaller details, and certainly of the emotions, the feelings that we have. So cancer, when you get a diagnosis, you may have been having symptoms that you feel, like pain or nausea or tingling or any number of physical symptoms. But there are some cancers for which you may not have very obvious symptoms that you feel physiologically. But think about it, when it comes to emotions, those are very feeling oriented. How do you feel? I feel disappointed. I feel scared. And even though there's a word to describe that, those are things that we can associate that with things that we feel in our body, whether it's, very unstable kind of in our core, butterflies in our stomach, fast beating heart rate, headache, dizziness, all these things we can identify if we think deep enough as we experience our emotions. So that's something that we need to really become much more deeply in touch with. Not just I'm feeling this, but what is going on in my body as I feel that, because that's going to factor into how we cope. So I want to look at, again, how we see or view ourselves against the backdrop of, one, the diagnosis, but all those other things we talked about, the things that are happening, our family history, my personal history, right? How did I learn to feel? I mentioned that before. That has to do with my emotional attachments. Was I made to feel wanted in my developmental relationships? Was I often punished? Was I often maybe teased or called names? Because those factor into how I develop my ability to feel or respond emotionally to things, to people, to situations, certainly to diagnoses. And cancer, even though actually it has been and still is on track to become the actually highest, the disease of the largest fatality, it is actually on track to surpass heart disease or cardiovascular illnesses. And whether or not it actually does that in this year or the upcoming years, the fact remains that it is the most feared illness generally. So that even with the diagnosis in and of itself, there are thoughts, there are sensations that just possess you, just shoot through your being, that really take you into a different place. So yeah, how do I see myself? Have I been resilient in past situations in my life, whether they were illness or other difficulties? Because those would factor into where my starting point is with this and how I move forward. If I have never been in that mind or heart space where I feel like I am capable of being successful, of overcoming, of transcending whatever a challenge might be, or if my history does not show that I've had some overcoming experiences that I can look back to and say I have made it through that, then that puts me at a disadvantage. And so it becomes important to look at, again, the kind of the tools that I already have in my heart and mind. What roles, excuse me, do I function in? And this is something that always becomes a real concern. And that is because in my years of interacting in a context of cancer, I can't tell you how many people I have interacted with, both survivors and caregivers, family members, and so on, who have shared a story of being the tent pole, the go-to person in the family. I am the doer. I'm the person who cares for everyone. That was my mom, superwoman. You know, everyone comes to me with their challenges. If they have an issue, if they need to get some clarity on something, some guidance, I'm that person. So frankly, I have never learned to be in a position where I could receive. I'm the giver. So it becomes really difficult to regulate emotions when I have this shock of a cancer diagnosis and the uncertainty that goes with the process of care. But then I'm also thrown out or challenged in my role of caregiving. I care for everyone, and now I have to be cared for. I can't really reconcile that in my mind because I've not functioned in that role. So what roles have you or do you function in? And the idea is to really slow down our thinking and processing, because frankly, with the diagnosis, our processes are put on turbo boost. You know, we have to make decisions at warp speed. We want to get through this yesterday. I want to get the results. I want to know what the pros and the cons are. All these things are really welling up in me, and those can actually trigger more intense emotions. And so therefore, a basic approach to one, emotional coping is awareness, but also slowing it down. What's really going on here? It's easy to see an emotional avalanche, but there are smaller components that if we pay attention to, it would put us in a better position to address. So what are my roles, and how are my roles being impacted, at least in my mind, by this diagnosis and process? And also, what are my strengths and my vulnerabilities? We are not always really good at taking inventory of ourselves or asking questions or observing from others. What do people see in me? What do I see in myself? Whether it's in my job, in my home, whatever roles I function in, what are my strengths? And what are those places that I can be easily overwhelmed by, or they're difficult for me, those tender spots in my heart, my mind, my life? Because again, these give us a good gauge that would be helpful in the context of emotional regulation. We want to identify those strengths because those are things that we need to draw on. And in terms of vulnerability, that's something that we often try to hide. We don't like to expose our wounds, and yet just a concept of vulnerability in terms of emotional coping, it's something that we want to actually begin to make friends with or become a little more open to, meaning opening our emotional selves to sharing those hard parts of our experience with others who are able to provide, like we talked about before, safety, worth, belonging, someone who can hear me without judgment, without trying to immediately come back with some immediate solution. Just hear me, just feel me. So all these things are important to look into, but how do I look at others? How do I see the world around me in terms of the people who are around me? And that starts with God, for those of us who are spiritual or religious, or if we're not spiritual or religious, that which is greater than me. We find ourselves, we are finite beings in this infinite experience. And so I think we can all identify that we are part of something greater. What is that greater? The universe. What is it that propels me, that gives me energy, that gives me a sense of purpose, that that gives me the sense that I am here in terms of showing up in life. So how do I view God or that which is greater, the ultimate? Because that also allows me to know, it feeds my sense of safety, worth, and belonging as well. Again, if I'm in a partnered relationship, then what's that like? Intimacy, being heard, feeling heard, feeling supported. Because if that's not the case, part of coping is really seeking out that kind of space where I can feel heard, or where I can actually begin to relate to my partner or help them to understand what these needs are, or why I am so sensitive about X, Y, or Z. And it's not about me necessarily wanting to get a quick solution answer. Sometimes we are fixers, and this is a time where it becomes important to not be so hasty to put a Band-Aid over things, because a Band-Aid only provides temporary relief. And so we need something that is stronger, much more enduring. But what about the larger family context? So children, siblings, parents, what are those relationships like? How do I show up there? How do I see myself? And as I talked about our personal history, who am I in my family? Am I the spoiled one that everyone just gushes over? Have I had to become the parent at a young age because my parents either were not there or had to work 2 or 3 jobs, or were ill, or any other conditions that existed? You know, I have many clients who at the age of 10 or 12 or 13, or frankly even at 5 or 6, had to be caring for younger siblings and grew up not having a childhood. So they always felt like they had to do for others because it was necessary. They were being depended on to function in those roles. That shows up with a cancer diagnosis. And one of the struggles is, yeah, I don't want to have to feel so obligated to function in this role, but I don't know how to not feel that way, right? And so it becomes really important, again, to step back, to identify these realities in our lives, and to be willing to have a conversation with that history in my own mind. And we'll get into that a little later, but even extended family, to the degree that you're a part of that, and or to the degree that that is part of your daily life experience, and how those relationships function. And then social networks. I've had several people talk about, you know what, everybody tells me I'm so strong, and everybody tells me how good I am, and how they couldn't do this. And frankly, I don't know how I could do this. What am I doing? I don't feel strong, and it does not help me to hear those phrases, because it makes me feel even less powerful. There's an expectation that's being projected onto me that I feel is very unrealistic. And so in the context of social networks, one of the things we're going to talk about in a second is boundaries, because part of advocating for myself is part of helping me to regulate my own emotions, is really identifying who I am in this big picture of my journey. So are there certain things that are helpful for me to hear? I would know what those are, or would find out in the process. And one of the challenges is to get beyond the fear of offending people, to be able to say, well, this is not helpful for me, and I understand that it's coming from a good place in your heart, but I need you to know that it's not helpful for me. So all these contexts that we function in factor into our emotional experiences. And so in terms of coping, we have to really find space, or create space, to talk to the universe, talk to God, talk to our family. And I say that knowing that that's often easier said than done, because when I try to talk to some people, is what I've often heard, and frankly, what I've experienced myself, not everyone is as willing to be receptive or willing to listen without defending, or without kind of insisting on a different perspective. But there's also a larger view. And so that's the view of the world. So we start with the view of myself and the view of others. And now we want to talk about the view of the world, the larger world of our existence as we think about our emotions and coping with them. So what does my community consist of? Is it the family? Is it a community of friends that are like family? Is it a church? Is it a community organization? Is it, social justice? Whatever community I am a part of, sorority or fraternity, safety with belonging. Do I see this coming from these spaces that I show up in or that I am a part of? And when they come, am I able to receive it, or does it feel different? Because here is where we might have to talk about boundaries as well. And as we talk about family now, before I mentioned the family illness history, and for those who have had people in their family who were ill before, so like I shared with you that my mom lived with ovarian cancer, there are other members of my family who have other types of cancers, and diabetes runs my family. So, but some of those things are easier to talk about than others, and also the roles that we've played to the degree that we were a part of those experiences would also function here, right? So questions of conscience, good and evil, right and wrong. I think the diagnosis of cancer sensitizes us to some of the, to really, to justice, and in terms of illness, but frankly, in terms of life. So we see innocent children or people suffering, and there is not an answer to the why. And so that feeds into, especially if I've been a person or my loved one has been a person who has been doing the right thing in terms of their lifestyle, in terms of eating habits and exercising and all of that, and giving themselves to what is good in this world. And all of a sudden, this diagnosis, which in our minds represents something that is not good. So why is this happening? Why do bad things happen to good people, right? And there is no easy answer to any of those things. So there's the struggle for acceptance, which is a big part of emotional coping. And so coming from the faith community, one of the things that is very common in the faith community is a form of denial for the sake of coping, which is, I don't have it, I'm not claiming it, I'm not identifying myself with cancer. Except that can really block our ability to, one, process our emotions, which are real. It actually forces us to push some of our emotions beneath the carpet, as it were, and not be able to address them. And then it can also dampen our willingness to be as intentional as we could or should be in terms of the process of care and healing. So, but anyway, we are struggling, or we do sometimes struggle with questions of good and bad in terms of not just ourselves, but the larger world. Why is my doctor following this regimen versus that regimen? So the systems, the medical system, the educational system, I spoke about roles. So we have kids, and now kids are in school or not in school. Kids are home, and some of us are in front of the camera right now and having to kind of work in the background with 8 arms trying to control different things. So all of these can become additional layers or sources of stress. The fact that as a cancer survivor dealing with the illness in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, now it puts you automatically at a higher risk of infection with the virus, as if the diagnosis itself is not enough. So now we are quarantined, we are isolating, and so on, and we have to be even more careful, not just for ourselves, but for those who are around us. So all these systems that are functioning become concerned, again, with respect to how we feel, our emotional regulation, and the meaning of existence. What does this all mean? We are meaning people. What's the purpose of this? Why now in my life? What's going to happen? Again, for people of faith, you might say, what's God doing in this, or you know, what's the big picture? Is this a mission, or what is it? So here are these questions again, and sometimes that can add to the confusion, or in some cases it can fuel maybe a sense of passion. So there's a spectrum of ways that it can impact us. But all that to say that these are things that we want to the degree that we can, become aware of, because sometimes it would be addressing these things to the degree that they, in terms of the intensity with which they might impact us, then we're able to experience our emotional world in a more wholesome way. So then what? I mean, what do I do about any or all of these things that show up? So I want us to take a look at this picture. It's a simple picture. It's just a drop of water. It's causing ripples. And as we look at it, I wonder if we see that even though that tiny drop of water is causing a disturbance in the larger body of water, the ripples seem to have this calming wave effect. One of the first things I encourage people to do is breathe. Yeah, breathe. We all breathe. We don't have to think about it, but that's the whole thing. We often don't think about it. And when the stresses are piled up, what's also going on inside is the secretion or the release of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, because we are plunged into this defensive mode, the fight-flight mode, or freeze, frankly, or collapse. And so that's an anxiety producing kind of state of being. And if we have all these different plates that are going on, all these different concerns, all these different sources of stress, then it's an ongoing production or secretion of these stress hormones. Our bodies were created so that these things respond to an incident of stress, a single attack, single incident. But when it continues, then the production or release of these hormones become toxic in our own bodies. So while cancer is an illness that thrives on a suppressed immune system, what's also true is that stress is one of the major suppressants of the body's immune system. So breathe. I encourage people to put an alarm or put a series of alarms in your phone to remind you to take deep breaths, like take deep breaths continuously for like 5 minutes. Just focus on breathing or focus on a picture like this. Calming. And breathe. Because that's what we often don't do. So we find ourselves holding our breath, or we find ourselves hyperventilating. All right? Connect. Connect with myself and with others. Quite often we don't take time out with me. And so I saw one of the questions, I'm sure we'll be addressing it, but what's going on for me? An important question is, what purpose is this anxiety serving? All right, or what is it provoking in me, or this fear, or this frustration, or this anger? Because it's important to understand, not that we don't know it, but to really grasp the fact that while I do not have control over what comes my way, like a diagnosis or the behavior or response of other people, I do have the capacity. I don't always feel it, but I actually do have the capacity to control my response. Part of being able or learning to control my response is pausing. The reason we lose control or we don't feel in control, or one of the reasons anyway, is that we're so engaged in trying to respond or trying to stay in control or trying to stay on top of all these things, all for good reasons, that we don't get or take the time to slow down and think about what each of these things mean for us. So connect with myself and others. Earlier, I spoke about having those conversations about what is important, what is helpful, what is not helpful, what I need from you at this time. And none of that guarantees that it will come from the person that you're hoping to receive it from, but it does not devalue the need to maybe have those conversations so that at least a thought could be planted so that I'm not the only one thinking about what I need, especially in the context of my closest relationships. And then finally, I think it's important to really pay attention to our psychological or psycho-emotional metabolism. And I use that term because I think it's a good analogy when we think of our physiological metabolism. So the idea of, I eat, I put things in my body, but in order for my body to work, it has to be these cycles, right? Or this cycle. So I put in stuff, but I have to put out stuff as well. So I need to go to the restroom regularly, unless I'm not taking in anything. But if I'm just eating and nothing is coming out, then that is a physiological problem. Well, it's also a psycho-emotional problem if that's what's happening. If I'm taking in all these stressors, all these different experiences, all these uncertain thoughts of uncertainty, all these frustrations, and there is no channel, there is no outlet. That's why it's important to breathe. That's why it's important to slow down. That's why it's important. Actually, another thing is the narratives that we hold, right? So the meaning that we make. If I, for example, I had someone who missed one of their screenings, they were very, very meticulous, very prompt each year in getting their screenings. And one year, and I don't recall what the reason was, they missed their screening that year. And the following year, they were diagnosed. And so they blamed themselves to no end, talking about the view of myself. And so if what's the degree that that is the case, then we need to think about the narrative. What is this narrative? Is it a true narrative? So am I really to blame because, I missed that? Are there other factors that may have gone into the diagnosis beyond exclusively the fact that I missed that, that screening? Was it a malicious missing of the screening? And quite often, more often than not, we find out that we hold on to narratives that are not entirely true. So when we embrace false narratives, then those trigger emotions that are founded on untruths. And so another challenge we have is to, again, just really take a look at the narratives that are functioning in our lives, the whys behind the whats. One approach to calming, to regulating, to managing our emotions is humor. And that's not always easy to think of when things are dark or feel dark or gloomy. But laughing is actually a good thing. It triggers hormones in us that actually work towards healing and restoration. And so if I'm able to look at a funny movie or funny memes or anything that would trigger laughter in me, and it might not be appropriate all the time, but look for those moments when I could use a good laugh and find a way to laugh. Your senses. So I talked about our emotions really functioning or manifesting in our senses. So part of regulating that is getting in tune and in touch with our senses, but also looking at feeding our senses with that which is wholesome. So for example, things like the sense of smell, aromatherapy, that can actually have these really calming impacts on our body system, but also on the thoughts that we might be harboring at any point in time. So the things we see, for example, this picture, or things like soundscapes or seascapes or any beautiful scenery or environment. Some friends I recently talked about going to Longwood Gardens, for example, and just spending a day immersed in all of this flora. And that really does have a calming mind. One of my hobbies is taking pictures. I love to take pictures, and you know, my rose tree just put out a couple of roses, and you know, I take those pictures because just looking at them can have this calming effect that we don't necessarily think about, but try it out. Try it out. So beautiful, and you can get soundscapes on YouTube or sceneries and so on, but also sound, auditory senses. So soundscapes, music, sometimes soft music, whatever genre is helpful for you or endearing to you. I love to listen to instrumental music, minus the lyrics, just listen to the instruments. And these things have an impact on our body, on our emotions, on our mind, right? So all of the senses, the sense of touch, holding on to maybe a pillow or a blanket and cuddling, or there are certain things, actually, when I talk about breathing, if you put one hand on your forehead, if you feel overwhelmed at any time, and just spend a couple minutes taking deep breaths in and out, like for a count of 4, with your warm hand on your head. These are things that can ground and center us at times. Forgiveness and certainly prayer. So we talked about relationships, and so there are challenges sometimes in relationships. And I think in this context, it's important to understand that forgiveness is an inability or unwillingness in part to let go of some of the debts that are owed to us, emotional or relational debts, and to understand that my ability to forgive factors into my health, not so much the health of the offender. So really thinking about the value of holding on to bitterness. How does it help? How does it benefit me or those others around me? And, you know, going on a path to letting go of those things, recognizing that I don't need to be carrying these additional loads. I'm almost done. Boundaries. So we mentioned boundaries before, but I think sometimes we're not always the best in drawing boundaries. There are certain things that I'm able to tolerate. There are certain things that are helpful for me. There are certain situations that are and are not. And it's important to really create some safe boundaries for myself. Boundaries can be rigid, where I don't let anyone in my space, where I don't open up to talk to anyone, or those kinds of things. Or they can be really diffuse, where everyone is getting to me and they can say anything, and then those things become overwhelming. But then I need to be able to strike a balance in my life and in those spaces in my life where, and it could be with people, but it could also be with things. So am I always on the phone, just scrolling through, just messaging? Those things can really cause disruptions in my ability to be balanced. So draw boundaries, whether it's with social media, whether it's with the news. If I am compulsive in doing something, cleaning the house all the time, and if it's helpful to me, that's a good thing. But if it's causing more anxiety, I need to think about drawing a boundary there. And so you could name the boundaries that might be necessary in your own life. Gratitude. We could become overwhelmed with so many things that we might lose sight of the things that we can be, or the people or the situations or experiences that we can be grateful for. And those can be things past or present, or even things that we're looking forward to in the future. Vulnerability is a big thing. And I think of it, there are many ways to consider vulnerability, but it's really, and that has to do with safety, right? Being able to talk about, for example, the things that I'm sensitive about, that I'm fearful about, that I am angry about, but just being very honest, especially about those sensitive parts of my world or spaces in my world. And that calls for engaging with either a person or community of trust. But trust calls for vulnerability. So there's a cycle right there. And then documenting the journey. So often we forget, and sometimes we forget some of the most important and some of the most helpful and endearing moments and meaningful moments. So document, whether it is scrapbooking, whether it's video recording yourself. I encourage people to journal, and that's not restricted to writing. You could video journal, you could video blog, you could use audio, and just speak out your thoughts so that at some point later you can look back and review your thoughts and interact with those thoughts in a way that is helpful. And certainly, right back to the beginning, meditating, right? So being able to calm down, breathing is so important, regulating this part of our system, and being able to focus. One of the things that scripture tells us is to meditate, to think on the things that are good and true and beneficial, and the things that are worthy and the things that are of a good report. Think on these things, and peace is going to be the outcome. So engaging our senses in ways that are intentional, in ways that are uplifting, in ways that are meaningful, to restore and to boost our sense of safety, worth, or value, and belonging. So I'm wondering if there are questions or comments. I'd love to open up for that at this time. I know that there were a few that were sent to me earlier today by Beth, and so we can start with those. I'm not